Hi, and welcome to another edition of Just Thinking. If you can believe it, another quarter of a year has gone by, and it's time to talk to Representative Carolyn Dykema about what things have been happening on Beacon Hill, what she's been up to. Hopefully you've received her newsletter. That's one thing we'll be asking Carolyn about to make sure that we all know how to get it. But at any rate, good morning, Carolyn. How are you?
Good morning, Mary. I'm very well, and it was great to see you at Celebrate Hollis.
I was just going to say the same thing. It was an interesting experience having it down Central Street. I rather liked it.
That was kind of the overwhelming feedback I got, is people really liked the venue, liked being able to push a stroller on the paved surface. And
yeah, and also to be able to, I felt some empathy for the store owners, how much easier it is for those who are along that street to just set up a little booth in the front of their store than it was to schlep all that stuff over to the field and stuff. But anyway, good job by everybody that was involved.
Agreed.
And yeah, it was fun. It was also fun just to get out. It was a beautiful day. So, Carolyn, let's start with that question about how to get your newsletter, because I think people might want to if they know it's available. So how do they get one?
Sure. The best way to do it is just email my office. Very easy, carolyn.dykema@mahouse.gov.
Okay.
I believe there's also a way to sign up on my website, although I hesitate to say that for certain because I'm not totally positive, but that's carolyndykema.com.
Okay. All right. Well, and if they went to carolyndykema.com, they could probably
find the contact information
all
for
that
the
other
office.
stuff.
Yep.
Okay. So your newsletter this time started out with an update on COVID. I feel like with limited time this morning, I'm just going to say the information about COVID I think is out there, and if you don't mind, we'll just sort of skip over that and go right to the budget.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the budget. One of the big things that jumped out at me was that we were able to put aside $1.2 billion into the rainy day fund, the stabilization fund, which is wonderful news and so forth. But going into the whole budget cycle, or during COVID of last year, everybody was in a holy twit about what was going to happen with revenues. Mm-hmm. What did happen with revenues, aside from federal assistance? What happened with revenues?
Revenues actually were very, very strong locally. Tax collections were very strong, much stronger than expected. And I think the initial kind of view was there was so much uncertainty. We really had no idea, whether it was going to be low, high, and it ended up being on the higher side of expectations. So of course, when you have an opportunity like that, when you have revenues that come in, when we have an opportunity to put them aside for a rainy day, because we've had a couple of rainy days now where we needed the money. So yeah.
No, I thought that was a really good development, but I was just curious as to how we got there, given what all of the backdrop was.
Yeah, because the assistance, the ARPA assistance, the federal assistance is really a completely separate conversation. So this was really just a core state revenue. So the economy, the bottom line is the economy is very, very healthy. The one thing that I consistently hear, though, is workforce.
Not enough of it?
Not enough of it anywhere. You hear it in the service industry, you hear it in retail, you hear it in, truck drivers. There aren't enough truck drivers. I was talking to DEP yesterday, and they were mentioning how trash collection, they don't have enough drivers to drive the trash trucks. And as you know, the National Guard has sent in some folks to drive school buses because there aren't enough school bus drivers. So that's
I hadn't heard that. My goodness.
That's a big challenge for the state because, how do we, it's really the matchmaking, right? We've got a lot of employers that we know need help. We've got a lot of folks looking for work. How do you provide workforce training programs that give folks the skills that match them up with the jobs that are open? So that's a lot of what we've been working on at the state as well, the workforce development piece.
I don't mean to sound like a negative, but we've been talking about that glitch between who has the training and who needs the training and who wants the people for, since the 90s when I was working in the state. And I guess right now there's a lot of question about whether do people really want the jobs that are being offered, or is it a disconnect between what our industries need and what the public wants to work at doing?
Yeah, that's probably the million-dollar question, Mary. I don't have the crystal ball on that one. I do know that there are a lot of people that are seem to be looking for work and interested in work, and it seems like we should be able to place them. The other interesting dimension to that, and I'm on the Women's Legislative Caucus in the legislature, and one of the things we're talking about there is the different impacts on women of COVID and how women have seen disproportionate impacts of job loss. A lot of factors in that, including childcare. You know, obviously, if you don't have a place to put your child and you can't, work, it's a problem. If you're a single mother, obviously a single income, that's a really big problem. And it really is hampering a lot of women from getting back to work because they still really don't have the care that they have. So you're seeing that conversation at the state level. You're also hearing it at the federal level. Our Congresswoman, Catherine Clark, has been talking about the need for child care for a long time, and they're, starting to really open the conversation about infrastructure, right? We talk about roads and bridges and water. Child care really is a critical infrastructure. We need to be thinking about it that way and fund it that way.
So when in the population of people that are unemployed, do we ever survey them to find out what it is that they are looking for?
Yeah, there is extensive work being done. In fact, we heard from Secretary Acosta, who's the Secretary of Labor and Workforce, and they're working very closely with the private sector to really understand the needs of the employers, understand what kind of training employers are willing, able, and want to provide versus what the state can do, and really recognizing that different business sectors, it's not a one-size-fits-all training program, right? You've got to have a training program very specific to that sector and really understand the needs. So that agency is obviously doing a lot of that work. We in the legislature are providing the funding. And of note, I think one of the great models that we can look at is the manufacturing program. There's a manufacturing caucus in the legislature, which was established by the prior speaker and is now being headed up by Representative Roy, who's right next door right here in Metro West. And he really has been kind of pulling together manufacturers, connecting them with the manufacturing partnership, connecting them with grant programs. So for example, if you manufacture widgets, whatever you manufacture, and you have a specific type of machinery that you use in your business, there's a grant program that will fund a training program in the Voc-Tech school, for example, to train people on that piece of equipment. So that company can partner with the Voc-Tech school, who trains both students. Sometimes they have evening hour programs for second career type people coming into the industry. So you really have to get down to that level.
Yeah, you do.
Right, to really understand the individual needs. So that's happening, but it's a challenge.
It is a challenge, and it's not going to go away quickly or easily. So why don't you just give us the brief overview of the budget and how it all fleshed out this year? It looks like we got a fairly good coverage in terms of local aid, but are there any other highlights that you'd like to mention?
Sure. Well, I mentioned the environmental highlights. The budget was
coincidentally
was an exciting time for me this year. This is the first session in the legislature that I've been chair of a committee. Yeah. So I'm the chair of the Environment, Natural Resources, and Agriculture Committee, which I think we talked about last time I was here. So in that role, part of what I do is I manage and help work through the amendments that were filed to the budget on the environmental side, and that ranges, everything from ocean and sea life protection, where we gave some funding, and also this year, what was very significant, and we may also talk about it in the newsletter, which is sustainable nutrition. Mm-hmm. COVID really has unearthed this need to have a more sustainable access to nutrition, both through food pantries, which have always provided that type of service, but fresh foods, and how can we connect farms and food from farms with our food pantries, with markets that will get them out to areas that need them, including some of our environmental justice communities, which can be food deserts, right, not have access to food, as well as our SNAP program, which is a low-income program to buy food, allowing people to buy fresh, locally grown food with that SNAP program is a new initiative. So funding for all those things is what we moved forward, as well as some DCR funding. You're going to see a COVID theme, because a lot of this year's budget was really how can we direct resources in those ways that people most benefit from in COVID. So DCR, as you know, Department of Conservation and Recreation, owns a tremendous amount of land in the Commonwealth, and a lot of that is open space. And we have seen, I'm sure you have seen, we've certainly seen like on the rail trails locally, people are just outdoors, right? When you couldn't be indoors from COVID, you were out walking, crucial to mental health, crucial to physical health. So, you know, maintaining those places, putting enough staff in those places to maintain the restrooms, things like that. So,
are you the right person to talk to about the invasives of the invasion of the invasives, not just here but everywhere, and what they do to all of that open space when it's not monitored?
That does fall under the committee purview, and I know we've gotten some interest from members in more funding for the invasives programs.
Yeah, so I will make a note, talk to Carolyn about invasives, because I'd really like to see us do something locally, having sort of an effort on our own properties, those that are both public tree belts. I mean, even along tree belts on Highland Street, it just kills me every day. We are losing massive trees that are this big around because they've been completely girdled by bittersweet. Okay, but anyway, I don't want to digress for today. So let's talk, one of the things that you mentioned in here was the Student Opportunity Act and how the budget affected that. Would you explain that to folks?
So the Student Opportunity Act is, for a long time, we've been talking about access to education and how education has changed so dramatically since the education funding formula was first created back in 1993, I think it was. So this, the Student Opportunity Act, which passed the legislature, I think it was last year. Time is a little bit of a blur.
It is, isn't it?
But it basically put in place a 6-year phase-in period where there would be more funding dedicated to public education over time. So there was an expectation that every year we would give a little bit more. So there was really a question whether we were going to be able to do that with the impacts of COVID, and we were actually able to, you know, put a significant amount of money aside to keep us on track with meeting that target goal. So that was a really big accomplishment, and I know important for the schools that have been doing their yeoman's share of work, you know, working with students. I was just talking with Doug Lack, a teacher here at Holliston High in the art program, and talking about just the challenges of adapting to the new, you know, whether it be remote learning and masks and all of this. I give a lot of credit to our teachers for, you know, sticking with it and doing right by our kids. It's hard.
It's hard. It is hard. So also within your newsletter, you mention frequently the environmental justice communities. What does that mean?
So there is actually, in the climate bill that we passed, there is a definition of environmental justice community and what exactly that means. It has to do with demographics, it has to do with underserved populations, and it kind of comes from this notion that where you live and your environmental factors have a lot to do with a lot of things, including your health. Asthma rates, for example, in communities where they cite power plants and things are much higher, which made people much more you know, likely to get COVID. So you see communities like Chelsea, for example, with very high rates of COVID, already had underlying very high rates of asthma in their communities, which can be, you know, connected in many ways to things in the environment. So looking at those communities that are disproportionately impacted by their environment and by job loss. In fact, there's a lot of the same communities that have lost jobs. A lot of them are communities of color, more urban communities, gateway cities. How can we really direct programs at those communities that have been the hardest hit and most impacted and really could benefit from this kind of lifting all boats concept and bring them in at a time when we honestly need them in the workforce as well?
Well, and that is one of the things that I was interested in, was you were talking about access to solar in environmental justice communities, and it was like there was sort of a disconnect. I mean, it was like, because it might cost money and they don't have the upfront resources, or because there's no land for big farms of solar, or what is it that interferes with that?
Yeah, it's so interesting. So if you think about solar, a couple of options, right? You can either put solar on your home, on your roof, or they have these community solar programs, which are these large solar installations, which are much easier to install and land is much more cost effective the further out you get from the city, right? In downtown Boston, you're never going to have a large tract of land to put a large solar facility. A lot of people live in apartment buildings or condominiums or places that you can't put solar on the roof, or you're not in control, right, as a tenant of access to solar. So how do we work more closely with tenants of these large buildings to, make solar more appealing to them, to get them to put solar on their roofs? So far, we've there hasn't been as much progress as I think people would hope. And so one of the conversations about access was how can we allow those folks that can't access it locally to purchase across these energy zones, so they could actually purchase some of the power that is coming off some of the large installations that we put out for in our neighborhood, for example, or even further west. It's sort of a paper transaction, if you will, but the way that the energy markets were structured, that wasn't able to happen before. So that was one of the changes that we made in the climate bill, is that we now are facilitating better access for those folks to solar.
Everything is so complicated in that you have layers and layers and layers of people that you have to deal with. And so if a landlord doesn't want to have a solar system on top of his or her building, you're just stuck. There is no forward. I mean, that's negotiated. Everything has to be negotiated then.
Right. Well, if it's private property, the landowner can determine whether or not they want to put solar on the roof. And that's actually a question that I've been working with some of the solar advocates to dig a little deeper on, to find out why an owner wouldn't want to do something like that, and there are reasons from it. As much as if I have to put a new roof on, I don't want to have to worry about removing solar panels. In the cases of parking lots, which make great opportunities to put the canopies, for example. Sure. If you live in an area that has high land values, you think, well, maybe the owner doesn't want to get into one of these long-term power purchase agreements because maybe they want to think about a new use for the property in a shorter period of time. So it kind of removes some of their options in terms of development of the property. So a whole lot that goes into it. Incentives, that's another thing. Do we need higher incentives? Yeah. So, there's a lot to know there, but I think the bottom line is what we would prefer not to do. I think there's general consensus is we really don't want to be using a whole lot of beautiful open space for these solar developments. We want to be careful about where we put them, and the ideal kind of low-hanging fruit, if you will, is on rooftops, right? You don't notice them. You've already developed the property. To me, it seems like a no-brainer. So, but how do we get there, right? How do we provide the incentives that we need to get developers to take this seriously?
Yeah. You are working with the electrical contractors, the Association of Electrical Contractors, on this particular problem, the whole idea of these neighborhoods where you're trying to build a more diverse workforce, you're trying to develop the solar and so forth. What is that relationship? What does it mean to be working with and supporting or whatever the Electrical Contractors Association?
Sure. Well, I work with a whole range of organizations. That my job is essentially, especially in this new role, is kind of building consensus, right, around these complicated issues. We bring everybody to the table, including the electrical contractors, who had a number of us in to talk to their membership about environmental justice, which is exactly what you're asking about. And so when we're talking about, creating workforce programs, for example, for people of color, why is that important? How do we get there? What's the landscape? So the contractors are kind of the front row, the frontline workforce, right? They're doing the installations of solar. It's helpful for them to have some of the context of why. And so at this presentation, I and some of my colleagues were really talking about, the fact that there are populations that have been underserved when it comes to the things that I've talked about before, healthcare impacts of where they live, access to jobs and opportunities. We are seeing in a whole new way what that looks like, and how do we translate these conversations, a lot of which came out of the George Floyd conversations that we had a while back. What is our responsibility as a state to make sure that these communities truly have equal opportunities, truly have equal access to education, live in healthy communities, can raise their children. And it's clear that we don't have a level playing field in Massachusetts. And part of solving that problem is working with groups like the contractors on like workforce development programs, because they're connected to some of these jobs. So it's how do we open these lines of communication? Because I've just found that when we start from at least the same set of assumptions about why we're doing something and what our goals are, it's a whole lot easier to row in the same direction. So that's really what that is to bring some of these frontline workforce folks into the political conversation at the State House and help them figure out how we can work together to get to some of these solutions.
So we talk about environmental justice, and you refer to those communities that are probably very familiar to all of us by name, the Chelseas or the gateway cities. I used to work in the Senate, and I had 3 of them right in the district. That would be Gardner and Fitchburg. So what about the suburban areas and their understanding of environmental justice within their populations as well? I mean, it's not like it's all sunlight and flowers just because you don't live in one of those communities. Are there conversations that are happening at the suburban level, I guess?
About the environmental justice?
About environmental justice, about the access to security of food or housing or health care or whatever, and access to workforce education. I mean, I understand the need to do that where the population is the biggest, where you have a lot of people to cover. But it seems to me that all of those situations probably replicate themselves in smaller quantities or smaller pockets, probably everywhere in the state.
Well, I think the equity issue, right? When you talk about equity, you're really, at least in my mind, you're talking about everyone having access to equal opportunity. I think there are certain communities where you see a greater disparity in access to opportunity, but I think there's work that we need to do in every community. And I think one of the great examples is around the farming conversation. Farmers are having a tough time. It is a difficult time for farming because land prices are very high. They're economically challenged to find a model that's profitable for farming. And the statistic on our tour that we recently got was for every dollar that a farmer spends, they bring in 96 cents in revenue. So if you just the basic math of that, right, that's only sustainable for a certain amount of time. So how can we ensure equity, not only equity of access to jobs in the farming community, but ensure that they're able to play a role in some of these other bigger conversations around access to food and insecurity. So I think we need to look, regionally, really understand the regional needs, and then work together to find regional specific solutions that get directly to those needs, as opposed to kind of trying to figure out a one-size-fits-all approach.
Well, you won't find one of those, that's for sure. So, all right, that's obviously a huge topic and one that's sort of personal interest. I think it's important, though, that we talk about a couple of specifics. There were some changes. There are some items in the budget for some infrastructure spending in Holliston, and for all of the communities, some access to additional funds for infrastructure work. What does that come to? I don't mean in dollars, but are they extra funds over and above what we normally get for our roads and construction, or are they just refilling that same pot?
So there are really, I think, 2 things to talk about there. One is the Chapter 90 funding. So every year the legislature allocates funding based on a formula which has to do with length of roadway. And there's some economic factors in there, but they get an allocation every year for sidewalks, any transportation infrastructure, which is a reimbursement program, so the community can decide how they want to use that money, and the state basically just reimburses them for the cost of that. So that was just approved a little later than we usually do because of some COVID concerns, but those allocations were, I think, what you were talking about from the newsletter is that. So that is an annual allocation. That is nothing new. What is a little different, which was also in the newsletter, were what we call earmarks. So we have an opportunity in the budget to advocate for specific needs of our local communities. So, for example, communities might come, or the town manager, for example, might come and express a particular need which I can meet very directly by specifically including that need as an earmark in the budget. So that's something that I negotiate for in the budget process. And so there were 2 earmarks, which are specific to this year, which I worked with the senator to get for Holliston, which was, one was $100,000 for Green Street. The town had brought to my attention that they were looking to redo the facilities down at the Green Street Goodwill Park. Knowing how important this open space, we talked about, people using open space and needing access to open space in COVID. I was really glad to get some money in for the town to be able to do that, and I understand that that is in the moving forward, which is exciting. And then the second project was I was approached by some local veterans who were looking to put in a veterans monument for Iraq and Afghanistan veteran Steve Napolitano. Working with the Legion, had kind of put that project forward, and really just wanted to make me aware that it was happening, so that I wouldn't, so that I wouldn't be surprised. So that they made a personal call, which was wonderful. And supporting veterans has been something that's been important to me from the very beginning, and I really felt like for that, to recognize those veterans who served overseas, we really. It's wonderful that the veterans were looking to raise funds to put up that monument, but I really felt like the rest of the community had a responsibility to do that for them. So I was able to get $30,000 in the budget for that project, which they are implementing now.
Is that the one that they're planning on doing along the rail trail?
Yes.
Good. The open space we've talked about. Did we leave out anything that you want to make sure that we cover?
On open space? Mm-hmm. No, I don't think so. If I think of something, I will.
Okay. So I want to talk about some of the conservation tours that you've been on, and having done some of these kinds of visits myself, I know that in the back of your head you can say to yourself, "Wow, this is a great way to spend a day." It's tiring too, but it's also a great way to learn. It really is an amazing way to learn. So you've done some that were farm-based, so obviously I care a lot about those. Have you ever been to one of the farms that does the manure to electricity?
I am so glad you mentioned that, Mary, because I thought of you. We went to Barstow Farms.
Did you? Yeah.
And got a great tour there. It's a 6th-generation family farm. Yeah. The daughter, who graduated from UMass, I think, who must be in her 20s, is a dynamo. And just really, doing all kinds of new things. And they were talking about their digester, which they were collecting compost from area food facilities, long-term care facilities and things like that, because there is a requirement at the state level if you, I forget what the threshold is, but if you are a producer of a lot of composting waste, you have a requirement to compost that. So they would bring it to the farm digests it through their digester, which was nothing more than this little, cap, basically, and they provided power for 160 local homes. So it's kind of that.
And the farm.
And the farm, right. So that's kind of the triple bottom line, right? Is like you get rid of the compost waste, keep it out of the landfills, which are filling up. You provide electricity, and you provide an additional revenue source for this farmer who, as I said, like their finances are tricky. So it's indispensable for them.
Yeah, as far as I know, we have 3, and I can proudly say that I was involved in all of those at one point in time. It took a long time to get all of those up and running. Beside the fact that they get their own electricity, so they're using manure, and actually the food waste generates electricity a lot better. It burns faster, it burns hotter, so it improves the efficiency. So the food waste at the time when we were doing it was generally from institutions, colleges, hospitals, and that kind of thing, where you'd get masses of it. And so the Casella was the contractor. Casella trucks would just go from there all the way to wherever it was, Hadley and Rutland is another place. But at any rate, those farmers then were able to sell electricity back to the grid. And so by selling the electricity, they were making an income. by dealing with their waste management, which is always a nightmare for a farm. You got 200 dairy cows, you got a lot to deal with, you know, and all of those problems go away with this digester system. It's just fabulous to me. Been in Germany for like 30 or 40 years they've been doing it, but you know, they had less land, they had to be more efficient long before we did.
Right.
So I think it's, just love it, just love it. It's my favorite project.
Well, the way that we're promoting, we've got these new agricultural infrastructure grants, which are these small grants. And there was, they had a grant application process, and what it funds is sort of additional, sort of capital investments that allow these small farms to be more efficient. So it would cover something like a digester. There's a whole range of projects that it could cover. But there were $35 million available to that program, which was snapped up immediately. There were applications for $200 million worth of capital for small farms, and that is one of the, I think, silver linings coming out of COVID is the interest in locally grown food and small farms and buying local has just, you know, grown exponentially. So one of the programs that it's getting a really careful look is, you know, what we want to do with that program, how we want to expand that to create new opportunities for these farms to meet some of these local needs.
Women too. Lots and lots of women are now farmers. This is, I think the last numbers I saw, it looked like it was actually tipping in more women than men coming into farming. So very interesting times. Well, let's talk about a couple of those things that your conservation tours that took you other places besides farms. Those are my favorite, so now tell me what's yours.
Yeah. So DCR.
Yep.
There have been, so as I said, there's been a lot of renewed interest in DCR properties. And there's been a conversation for a very long time about whether DCR is properly funded. As a kind of an agency that maintains open space, I think there was unfortunately a need to make some difficult decisions back during the recession of 2008, 2009, and DCR was disproportionately impacted in their budget. And I don't remember the numbers around employees, but their staff were dramatically reduced during the recession, and they have added some incremental staff since then, but they're nowhere near where they used to be, and it's really being seen in the condition of the DCR properties. And what was a real education for me, and this, we went out to these properties, I guess is the bottom line, to actually see not only how they were maintained, but also just the diversity of types of sites. I mean, we had everything from just what you would, you know, a basic park like Hopkinton State Park in my district, to you know, these old quarries that they're maintaining. They have some old buildings, old structures that they're maintaining. They have a Maudsley State Park, which is up in Newburyport, beautiful property, but they've got old farmhouses that they're trying to maintain. They've got programming for local people, so they have to staff and do the educational development. It's just a tremendously diverse array of things. They do like a lot of fire management training, much deeper, you know, expertise than I was sort of thinking that was needed. A lot of engineering expertise is needed there. So there is a question about, you know, whether DCR is prepared to do the job that they need to do, especially now with such a focus on what they do. So there is a commission which is ongoing where we've had a number of public hearings, multi-stakeholder group involved here, really to do an overall assessment of DCR, whether their capital needs are adequately met, whether their staffing needs are adequately met. So that draft report is going to be coming out next month. But this was really an opportunity as chair of the committee to go out and actually see the front lines, you know, see all these things that we talk about in the hearings. Let's really see and hear from the people that work there, hear what their challenges are, so that, you know, what we were reporting was actually reflected by what's going on the ground. So it's been an eye-opener, I tell you, and not to mention the fact as legislators to be out and actually seeing each other in these outdoor settings when we don't see each other in the building. For me personally, it just makes my job much easier because it facilitates conversation with my colleagues.
Right.
So it's another win-win.
Well, the other thing, doesn't DCR also do woodlands? Aren't they the ones that, they have a bunch of managed woodlands?
Yeah, they do forestry management,
Yeah, because that's where I've interfaced with them in the past. And then there was one fellow that was absolutely talented about building meadows. I mean, you don't think about it, but meadowlands have a place in the whole, yes, it attracts birds and all that kind of stuff, but in the whole fragile network of water supply and filtration and all of those other things. you know, a meadow. We used to have meadows everywhere. People that can't imagine that these days, you know, but there used to be meadows everywhere, but there was this guy.
Well, one of the things we talk about, and talk about everything is connected, right, in the ecosystems, one of the things, you know, I've been working on for a long time is pollinators, and, you know, the impacts of decline in pollinators and how concerning it is. Well, one of the challenges is the lack of forage, because a lot of the native plants, you talk about invasives, a lot of that crowds out a lot of the native plants that have the flowers that a lot of these insects are dependent on, and these insects are critical for, you know, not only for pollination, but the, you know, for feeding birds, and, you know, which move seeds around, and so it's all this very, you know, subtly connected network that depends on meadows and healthy meadows. So, you know, how can we be intentional about how we do that? So I didn't know that. I love to hear that there's a meadow person.
Guy. A meadow guy. I wish I still had these business cards. You know, they're probably long gone from their departments at this point, but I did find that it was an interesting department. I think years ago, didn't they take what was the Boston Street, the parks and stuff?
The MDC. It's the old MDC.
They put it together with the State Department, and so then I
Conservation Management.
I think in that merger, there was a lot of stuff that kind of fell off the plate, and focus kind of got shifted, because those are two very different orientations. And it's probably taken some years just to flesh all of that out, but at any rate.
And I think you're right, there's still a bit of a legacy of that. Even though that was a very long time ago, you still see it in the organization.
Yeah, and it's the, you know, who's in charge, whose policies and whose priorities go first. And they probably have they probably need to do some work on just that kind of organizational development about what is this agency about.
And that very much came up
Yeah.
in this report. So there will be more to come on that.
Yeah, if you don't know what your identity is and who your audience is, then it's really hard to get your goals.
Or even a cultural difference, you know,
Yeah, there
merging two organizations that have very different cultures and approaches, that can cause some challenges too.
You know, I've always found that you know, systems can be pretty disrespectful of the people that are involved in them. So they don't stop to think about those two organizations. While they are organizations, they're really nothing more than people.
People, yeah.
And they don't ever consider what the impact is on the feelings of those people when you start talking about taking something away, something that was maybe their identity for 20 years, something that was, and I don't mean taking away their job, taking away just who they were, you know, and there's very little done with that kind of thing. The Office of Public Collaboration, which used to be, well, I can't even remember what the initials were before, we used to go in and do mediation for some things when there were departments that weren't getting along with one another. All of that's gone away. You know, it's now over at UMass Boston, and that's fine, but the state needs it. Mediation training and all that kind of thing. Anyway,
Well, one of the other things that was great about doing these tours is it was really an opportunity for the committee to recognize some of the people doing this work on the front lines. You know, we got to hear from the people actually doing the work who told their story, and we had an opportunity to sort of kind of share our thanks on behalf of our constituents for what they do and how important they've been during COVID in particular.
Yeah,
so
I think that's terribly important. It's terribly important. So let's talk about Metro West trails.
Trails are big.
Aren't they big?
They are big.
Did we ever know, did Robert Wydeck know something that we didn't know way back when?
He is the go-to guy.
Isn't he?
I mean, definitely in Metro West, but I think, you know,
in the state.
In the state, really.
Well, actually, he and I have talked briefly about a trail that goes from Florida to the Canadian border, I believe, and there's a gap around Lowell.
Appalachian Trail?
No, that's not that. But this is a bike trail, literally. And there's some gap that happens around Lowell. But I mean, he knows all about this. It doesn't matter where the trail is. If it's sort of in the east of the Mississippi, he's probably got his finger in on it. So anyway, so tell us a little bit about just what is this whole effort within the trails. You say that there's a regional collaboration? So
they're the Metro West Regional Collaborative, which is a sort of state-oriented, it's part of the MPO. So it's kind of, I guess I'd call it a quasi-state organization that really pulls together Metro West towns around issues of interest. So they because of the interest in trails, they pulled together this regional forum, if you will, to talk about trails, talk about where we need connections, like you're talking about in Lowell, but even in Metro West, we have a lot of opportunity to connect. You know, the trail, the Charles River Trail, which, you know, Holliston is part of, that's supposed to be a loop.
Right.
You know, including Milford, which is complete, supposed to include Hopkinton, which again also has patches that need to be kind of connected. So how do we move through to complete those loops, not only for recreation, but for the Charles River Trail actually would connect people to Framingham, to the train station. So you could, as a Holliston resident, you know, ride your bike in the morning to the train and get on the train. And you know, what a great way to get cars off the road, to avoid traffic, like so many wins in that one.
Yeah, yeah.
We need to get there, and you know, one of the things that the state is recognizing, I think, is how important these initiatives are for a lot of reasons, and that, you know, there have been, you know, dedicated initiatives with more funding to empower towns like Holliston to be able to, you know, complete their trails and keep them up. And Robert's really been key in helping other communities trying to do what Holliston did in connecting them with state programs that can support their, you know, trail building.
If I remember correctly, the piece in Framingham gets to be the biggest obstacle. It's not terribly high on their list of priorities at this point because they've got so many issues going on in that town.
In Framingham.
Yeah, in Framingham, but that's the link that's going to be probably the most difficult to, somebody's going to have to help them. You know, I think the state's probably going to have, if you really want to end up being able to access that train station, that's the gap that the state's probably going to have to come in and just offer some support in figuring out how to make that happen. So before we go wrap up, I want to give you the chance to, there are a couple of things. Tina Hine was named this year as, what do we call those?
It used to be unsung heroine.
Yeah.
And now it's called Commonwealth heroine. And I actually initiated that change because they shouldn't be unsung.
Yeah.
And we don't want to underscore the fact that they're unsung. We want to underscore what they have done.
Okay.
So they changed the name to Commonwealth Heroine, and it really recognizes women who make outstanding contributions to their local community. And Tina, every time you turn around these days, you see Tina's great work in transportation and community building. She's really made a tremendous impact in her time on the select board. So it was nice to be able to nominate and then recognize her for that.
That's good, and that is great. Okay, and then the Real ID was one thing I wanted to make sure that everybody understood. Our deadline for having a Real ID has been extended.
Because of COVID.
Because of COVID,
Yep.
So is it to 2023 or something of that nature?
I honestly don't remember off the top of my head. So it's in the newsletter, right?
Yeah,
it has been extended.
But it was extended.
So the Real ID, for people that, you know, don't know what the Real ID is, it's when you go to the registry to renew your license, you have to provide additional documentation, and then that you get a little star on the corner of your new license, a little yellow star, which allows you to use your license when you get on a plane, for example. So starting in whatever the date was, up to 2023, I don't remember.
I think it is.
That you will need that star on your license, otherwise you'll have to have your passport to get on a plane. So.
Now, just quickly, the last thing that I had said I'd like us to chat about was just redistricting. You explained that it is underway, that, you know, things are beginning to move. This is the year 10. We have to do it every 10 years. And you anticipate that maybe because of population changes here, we may see a difference in the district in which we sit?
We could.
And do you think it's just the House seat, or do you think it's also the Senate seat?
You know, there are all kinds of things moving around. I wouldn't even want to speculate.
Yeah.
Just to say that I know that the numbers in my House district, for example, and we're talking about House of Representative districts, we're talking about state Senate districts, we're talking about the congressional districts.
Oh.
So it's all three, and Governor's Council districts, so all the districts are moving around. But my district has grown. I was mentioning to you, Hopkinton alone has grown by 25% since the last census was done. And the goal of this redistricting process is to make sure that all House districts are at roughly 43,000 people. So I have been told that because of our population, I am over that. So there will need to be some shifting, and my understanding is that some of the neighboring districts are also have grown and are over their allotment. So it ends up being a very complicated math question for how you kind of put these districts together in a way that makes sense, with communities that, for example, if you have a school district, where you share a school system, it would make sense to have those communities together. Or if you have other shared resources, to have the same rep to talk about those. So we'll see. It's a Rubik's Cube, really, to find a way to put it all together.
And who does it?
So there is a special committee on redistricting, which has two very capable chairs in Rep. Moran on the House side and Senator Brownsberger on the Senate side. Rep. Moran really led the last redistricting initiative, which, as I was saying earlier, was one of the few redistricting efforts in the country that wasn't challenged in the courts, which was kind of a badge of honor for Massachusetts, that it was really a transparent process, which incorporated voices of all the advocacy groups that you can imagine who were concerned about this, numerous public hearings. So this process that we're following this time around is very, very similar, with perhaps some learnings and some improvements that we got from last time, but hopefully duplicative of the very successful effort that we did last time, where everyone, not everybody's going to be happy, right? Things change, it's difficult, but at least everyone feels that they will have been heard and their concerns were considered in the process. So as I was mentioning, the critical time frame is that there is an election coming up in 2022. And when you run for your legislative seat, by statute, you need to run in the district that you're going to serve in. So we need to have
future serve.
Right. When you take your seat, you will be running in that seat. So we need to have those districts done really by November, so that people can announce that they're running for these seats. It's coming up, comes up quick. So we need to have that. We will have that done sooner than later. So you'll be seeing that probably before you see me next.
Oh, we'll talk about it next time.
Yes, we will.
All right. Did we leave anything out that you really feel we need to cover?
I'm sure we did, but I can't think of it at the moment. We'll cover it next time.
There's so much. There's so much. Anyway, as always, these glasses, can't stand them anymore. They're driving me nuts. Thank you very much for being with us.
As always,
and,
thank you for having me.
We'll see you soon. Once again, thank you, and good to see you, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.